Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the occasional Traveller in the Evening podcast with me, Andy Wilson, editor of The Traveller in the Evening. Today I have with me Mark Vernon, who you're if you've been following the podcast, you'll already be familiar with because Mark and I have spoken in the past. But I know Mark through what I usually call the Blakeosphere, which it includes Blake scholars in academia, but it's much wider than that. It includes artists inspired by Blake, independent scholars, thinkers of all kinds, countercultural figures. And within that world, I'll describe this from my point of view. Mark will have a completely different impression. But my interest there increasingly is in what you would call Blake reception. How has Blake been interpreted today? And how does that reflect current political issues, current mores? And I'm fond of something that E.P. Thompson, the great historian, said about Blake, which is that Blake is like a picnic to which he brings the words and we bring the meanings of the words. And of course, we all bring different meanings. I think Mark in his book is doing that. He's bringing his meanings. I bring my meanings. So that's where we're going to try and pitch the discussion today. So having said that, by way of an introduction, I'd like to, what normally happens at this point is that I tell you all the tremendous things about Mark and all of his achievements and his huge bibliography and all this kind of thing. But I find that annoying and tedious. But what I'd like to do is just invite Mark to do that for himself so he can maybe situate his work in terms of his own story, you know, where he's coming from, where he's up to, particularly what led him to write this book. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, well, look, thank you so much. It's lovely to talk again and to reflect on these things. And I think the reflection for me matters partly because it's in the teasing these things out that they come alive in each of us, but we hope in listeners as well. As Blake might say, you take your spirit to the spirit of a text, and then in the meeting of those spirits arises something that's of value to you. In terms of my own engagement with Blake, I mean, you know, Blake's been part of my life for a long, long time. But I've been reading Blake fairly intensely with others in reading groups for about 6 years or more. And the book is partly a product of that much more intense engagement, giving voice to what we've been discussing being the next stage for me in terms of, you know, speaking with Blake. I think maybe it's significant that I work as a psychotherapist, so I'm very interested in inner life. And I feel that whilst for me, part of the importance of Blake is that he writes before modern psychology, that's part of my reasoning for turning to him. Nonetheless, I think that he's very astute about the way inner life works. So that's part of the appeal. Probably worth also saying that I've got a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy. And so the Platonic side of things particularly speaks to me. I also have a degree in physics, which doesn't make me a physicist, but does mean that I have some sense at least of what's going on in science. And so, you know, Blake and science is a huge theme as well. And then I used to work as a clergyman actually in the Church of England, but the most important bit of that in terms of engagement with Blake is that it is the religious, stroke spiritual, stroke Christian, but also the other than Christian elements in Blake. So particularly engagement with indigenous Americans and also Indians. And in particular, the texts that were coming in from the activities of the East India Company in the Georgian period. So the Bhagavad Gita in particular. So that mystical side of Blake is a really key part of what draws me. But also I've become very aware that the Georgian period in which he lived, many historians regard that as the period in which our mentality, the sense of what it is to be a modern person, really bedded down. And so I feel Blake offers a kind of spiritual analysis of our times. He would say that he's a prophet, but I think what that means is that he understands the undercurrents, the kind of inner dynamics, the workings of the imagination that have become now manifest very tangibly often in our times. And so whilst I'm interested in Blake for his own sake, I think it's as a prophet of our times as well as his that I want to engage with him. So maybe that says something about where I'm coming from and the expertise that I can bring as well.
I think it says a lot about it, actually, because in terms of my interest in reception, without naming names, I've read books about Blake in the last 5 years that are nonsense. They're coming from just tittle tattle, speculate, all kinds of things, and not impressive at all. That one thing, or I should say this to the readers, I haven't finished reading Mark's book. I was telling him earlier, I've got to page, I think it's 258, about 2 minutes before we turned on the recording for this podcast. So I'm a swirl with ideas and responses from it. I've been reading it very intensely for the last few days. But one thing I would say about it was a couple of things I want to say. One thing is that you say that you studied ancient Greek history, or was it philosophy? Did you say
Philosophy, yeah.
Philosophy and science, and you're interested in what happened because through the East India Company with the bringing of Hindu and Vedic thought to this country, which Blake was an early subscriber, as it were. He certainly read the Bhagavad Gita. He was an early reader. So that's a massive amount to talk about. We've got science, Greek philosophy, Blake, spirituality. So where really do we begin? Well, one thing I'll say as background for our listeners is that Mark and I touched base or had some common interest in defending just the basic fact of Blake's Christianity, which I think is remarkable that I have to say to an audience like this, that many Blake scholars and so on today would even deny that Blake was a Christian. And of course, we've all read Blake's, what's it called? All Religions.
There's no natural religion and all religions are one, and the early pamphlets, yeah.
Yeah, and so we know that Blake has this non-sectarian Christianity, but to deny that he was Christian seems to me utterly absurd. So I've considered Mark a sort of ally in that regard, and we both put that case. But with regards to everything else, I do think you've delivered an incredibly coherent book, but possibly even more coherent than you think, but it certainly reflects what you've said of your interests. And so that's really good news for readers of your book. We'll talk more about the content, why, but it's really good news. It's a coherent book from a coherent point of view. It's not one I agree with primarily, but we'll get into that because that's what might make it interesting if we explore those areas. I was almost thinking like lacunae, what I think some bits that are missing in the text, because that sort of draws attention to what you're focusing on. So there's a lot to explore in that regard. Where we start is a bit arbitrary, but I will say that I was really, really looking forward to this book because of its focus on the imagination. One thing I've increasingly convinced of and keen to talk about is this absolute centrality of the imagination to what Blake is saying. It's the foundation stone of the whole thing. And also, but having said that, when we talk about the imagination, I think for many people today thinking about Blake, they just think of that as, the imaginative arts, painting and singing and things like that. But it's a much more profound position than that. That was my interest. It's got Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. So that's what really got my attention, a book about the imagination. So, Mark, to start things off, as I went through the book, it clearly is about the imagination, and you discuss the imagination on every other page, but usually quite functionally, saying, the imagination is required to do this, the imagination is necessary to do that. But I wondered, you can tell us a bit about that, but I was interested in going a bit beyond that and asking you, what did you learn about the nature of imagination itself? And I think, given that it is such a philosophically contested concept, so given that it's a book about the imagination, let's kick off by asking you to say something more about that.
Yeah, so I think the imagination for Blake is how we perceive. And so in that sense, it has this absolutely fundamental functional role because, as Blake often says, as a man is, so he sees. And it works both ways. What you see very much shapes how you are, who you are, where you are even. So it is a fundamental notion in Blake. I think Blake saw coming, though, a kind of contraction of the imagination that is perhaps the default understanding that people have now, which is the sense that the imagination is a kind of private possession that you have, I might have, someone else has, a so-called creative person probably has in a fuller measure, and that is the kind of notion of imagination that somehow beamed out from us across an otherwise inert, if not dead, cosmos, and we inject meaning into the wider world, therefore, through our imaginations. And I think Blake saw that coming. It's explicit, actually, in writers like John Locke, Adam Smith, David Hume, who he engages with. They even remark, that this is going to lock us in ourselves. And it's one of the fundamental reasons, I think, for the modern sense of alienation and disconnection. And so Blake, I think, very much wants to challenge that. It's not that you or I have imagination or not. The question is how we're collaborating with the imaginative unfolding manifestation of all things that surrounds us, as well as ourselves. So, as Blake puts it, nature is imagination itself. So I think he was very much against this contraction of the imagination, this uncoupling of us from the wider world that comes about with this privatization of the imagination. I think, though, that he also saw it not just as a function, and this is particularly what comes out in the last part of the book. So it's possible, Andy, that you haven't quite got there yet, because it's really when I get to the full-on Christian side of Blake, in the last couple of chapters particularly, I sort of wanted to prepare the grounds to guide people to that point, so it doesn't just come in as if it's some sort of declaration, let alone sort of dogmatic assertion about Blake, to sort of feel into why Blake is Christian, why he's a mystic, because I think that 200 years on, we very much need to do that because it's not self-evident. But nonetheless, I think that Blake identifies the imagination with Jesus, and Jesus there meaning the creative impulse that runs through all creation. In Christian orthodoxy, it would be called the logos. And the logos is a Greek word that's sometimes translated as word, but it doesn't just mean the declarative or the sign kind of sense of word. It means the active impulse that runs through all things. It's the allure as well as the naming, if you like. It's a performative word that creates, and Blake sees that fundamentally as an imaginative word that's part of the outpouring of the divine life. So another favorite Blake word is emanation, and the ancient Greek part of me knows that this is a Neoplatonic word, and it's very much about the outpouring from the one into the many things, and then the one is then detected as present in the many things imaginatively. And this is why the minute particulars are so important for Blake. And he can see a world in a grain of sand. The grain of sand, even the humble speck of dust, can breathe forth its joy, as he also puts it in another place, because even it humble dust, humble grain of sand, is a manifestation of the divine imagination. And so the all is present in the minute particulars. So it's this very dynamic sense of creativity, but also it's the very life that we feel. And this is the sense of imagination that connects us to truth, to goodness, to beauty, because of our participation in that. We can become collaborators, can become more aligned, even co-creators with this imaginative divine presence in all things. So it's, you can't affirm the imagination in all its forms and in all its liveliness, its vitality in us more strongly than Blake did. And so hence, it's not just a question of the business of how we perceive or don't, the nature of our humanity, but it's also about the divinity, it's at the heart of Blake's mystical vision as well, I think.
I mean, it's undeniable your book does. I've said that I asked the question that I asked, but there's no doubt at all that you laid on really appropriately thickly about the centrality of the imagination. I do think sometimes that we give too much ground to the empiricists because they say, oh, there's just dead matter out there. And then we feel like we have to, as it were, project what isn't dead back onto the world. I'm reading this very beautiful book at the moment called Catching the Light, The Entwined History of Light and Mind. part of which talks about ancient perceptions of light as being something that comes from within and illuminates things. So there's the light that comes to us and the light that goes out there. And it's very much like what you're saying about the imagination generally. I would say that the sense in which we sometimes give too much ground to the empiricists is in treating the objects as if they were as the empiricists describe, and then thinking we have to add something which is our point of view. Whereas, in fact, as Blake knew, and as you know, these objects don't exist in a dead way outside of us, and they never exist for us as objects. There is never the raw tree as Hume or Locke imagined that we then have to decorate with our minds. The objects always exist in a sort of manifold, as the phenomenologists would say. There isn't the object plus the subjective, our imagination, which is a kind of putting lipstick on the turkey, as they say, spray painting it. But in fact, these things always exist together as a manifold. And so I think that's it makes it easier to understand what Blake is getting at, because we don't have to be adding something to reality. It's there, as you say.
I mean, maybe just to add something to that, because I think another important thing to say actually about the imagination is that Blake saw, I think, a huge imaginative undertaking evolving in his time that had come about particularly because of the enormous success of the work of Isaac Newton, and then figures like John Locke on the back of that wanted to apply what Newton had applied to the physical world, to what we now call psychology in particular, but also to other matters like society, government, and so on. And Newton's wildly successful imaginative insight was that, for example, that which causes an apple to fall is also that which causes the moon to orbit the Earth, the law of gravity. Or how he could see that an enormously diverse set of phenomena might all be governed by a simple law, like the second law of motion, F equals ma. This is an enormous imaginative perception, actually. But Blake also saw that partly because of its very success, but then also partly because of the power it promises, i.e., maybe the rest of the world can be organized according to simple laws, both morally as well as physically. Or maybe the world could be ruled politically by simple laws as well. This was a hugely attractive prospect for those who lived in the wake of particularly Newton. So things like John Locke, and then both actually the revolutionaries of Blake's time, like Thomas Paine, but also the establishment, like the King, they felt that this was a way to reorder the world too. And Blake sees this coming across all parts of society, all parts of our engagement with the natural world, with the cosmos even too, and realized that its very success imaginatively was going to be its undoing, because it was going to force the imagination into the focus of trying to come up with more laws. They might be moral laws as well as physical laws, or the kind of legal system that could form a government, maybe through declarations of independence, rights of man. And Blake saw that Newtonian spirit was absolutely the dynamism that was unfolding in the Georgian period, but he also saw that it was going to lead to a kind of tyranny, to a disconnect of humanity from each other, let alone from the natural world and from the cosmos. And so that's why he wants to champion the imagination, because he precisely sees it too as the dynamic that is at play, even as the empiricists would deny the imagination. Single vision and Newton's sleep is a kind of forgetfulness about the power of the imagination, not an unimaginative thing. And so
Yeah,
I think this is also why it's so important in Blake to see that he's not saying that we need to kind of discover something we've forgotten. We need to remember how things actually are and see what that's done. And as you say, part of what it's done is it's sort of turned rocks into dead objects. It's uncoupled human beings from each other, because realizing that this energy is still completely active around us, this imaginative energy. And of course, you see it. The entertainment industry has burgeoned in the time since Blake. People were starting to write novels again then. And now, of course, we have online interactive games and so on. This, in a way, is a kind of strange echo of the imagination that Blake is saying makes us. But because it's been treated now as fantasy, its truth-bearing faculties are kind of denied, or that how we have to discern all this is denied. Um, this is the part of the complication of the world that Blake, I think, saw coming, and we can now know.
I would go even further than you. You know, when you say that even the work of Newton is imaginative, I think I would go further and say it's all the product of imagination. The worst things you can imagine are the product of imagination. Donald Trump is the product of the imagination because the imagination is all powerful. So it creates the lot, you know. So and we live in a collective social imaginary that is the product of the free decisions of humans over a long period of time. It doesn't really matter, but one slight quibble I have with your book is that is you very much focus on the Georgian period forward, and I think emphasise the turn that was taking place then. But I think these things go back much further to the origins of civilization, really, you know, a good 40,000 years. But my point in saying that is that this notion that the scientific worldview is problematic. I mean, I spend a lot of time arguing with secularists and atheists online, not that I want to, and they talk this awful nonsense about what is science. But you know, many people have pointed out this process. You don't have to be a mystic to do that. I'm a great fan of the philosopher Adorno. You know, he was a Marxist philosopher, but he famously wrote the book about, you know, the dialectic of enlightenment, about this wider view of society that emerges, which I'm not going to talk about it much because we all talk about it in a way, and it's also the subject of your book. But the way that the scientific so-called objective attitude is applied inappropriately to everything, and it kind of runs out of hand. So the question is, how do we situate these arguments within that reality? In those terms, a second area I wanted to explore with you was something you said yourself in the introduction about therapy, because one aspect of contemporary Blakeanism that I'm somewhat critical of is what I've decided, you know, hopefully amusingly rather than offensively, to call a moderate hydraulic Blakeanism, which is using Blake to sort of take the characters in Blake, for example, you know, the Zoas and Urizen and these, and treat them as psychological faculties or propensities, which of course, among other things, they are, but then sort of treat Blake as somebody who's managing the relationship between them in the interests of mental health, where mental health can be considered either A, as mental health as we understand it today, or even in an expanded sense, as you do, to achieve a sort of, I was going to say, a sort of Maslowian peak experience, an experience of the oceanic and the divine, but to see that as the pinnacle of experience that we're sort of driving towards, and that we do it through the management of these characters. And I think there's a tendency in your book to do that. You know, I want to explore that a bit with you. And the tendency appears when, you know, we're all sort of trading off one thing against another. So for example, it's okay to reason. There's nothing wrong with science. Reason's good, but don't overdo it. Money's good, but don't overdo it. Everything becomes a matter of careful management, you know, like managing your own being, as it were. And if you manage it carefully, you'll be happier. And no, there's nothing wrong with therapy, but is Blakeanism merely therapy? Well, of course it's not. I mentioned earlier, I suppose one way to ask this to you is in to talk about that a little bit in general, but one thing that occurred to me as a way to ask it is I mentioned Abraham Maslow and the Maslowian sort of hierarchy of needs. And Maslow's idea is very much that this is a hierarchy and that the needs at the lower level must be satisfied before needs at a higher level can be successfully addressed. So to get to the peak experience, like Squid Game, you've got to go through every phase of the game to get there. I'll give you a concrete example to talk about. So you talk about the modern capitalism that was emerging in Blake's time, and you talk about it as mercantilism, and you quote Adam Smith talking about people getting off on buying a load of stuff, you know, the love of money. But your general approach is to say, well, that's not like a terrible sin in and of itself, but if you allow yourself to be taken over by that, then you won't be able to have this experience of the divine because you'll be consumed by this self-consuming desire for more products. So that's what I want to talk about, but I want to throw in one more idea before you do, which is that I genuinely believe that people today worship mammon, right, in a pretty straightforward biblical sense. And you use the term, you say we shouldn't worship mammon, the love of money is the root of all evil, or whatever they say. I was thinking about that. So I looked up mammon in my book of demons in the Bible, and it says that the word mammon in the New Testament is only ever used by Christ, and the Aramaic root means something like that in which you place trust. Now, I'm not a follower of Jesus in the following regard, okay, that I'm about to say, is that it seems to me that Jesus was asking people to basically abandon their wealth, give it to others, abandon your trust in that. And yet, when we're at Sunday school, of course, I don't know if you went to the same kind of Sunday school as me, but they teach you about the eye of the needle, where the rich man can't get through the gate into Jerusalem unless he unloads a bit, enough to get in. And the problem with that is that there was, as far as I know, historically no such gate in Jerusalem as the Eye of the Needle. It's a fairy tale told to make you feel warmer towards wealthy people. And so, in those terms, I thought your argument was of the latter kind of persuasion. It was about don't overdo it, don't worship mammon too much, if you like, as opposed to don't put your trust in money, which may be a much harder injunction to follow. Certainly, I haven't given all my wealth away, but nevertheless, it seems to me that that's at the core of the Christian idea. So, and this is related to what I was saying about the therapy business. Don't overdo that. Bit of that, too much of that is good for little bit of what you like does you good. Or while we have all seen this kind of rationalizing approach to the world leads to all these problems, isn't that in a way another kind of rationalizing? This self-management, just becoming a better person in a kind of loose everyday sense. And in a sense, that's a criticism. So I'm asking you, what do you make of all of that?
So I want to push back strongly because I do agree with you about the managerialism, and I'm trying to present a Blake that doesn't do that. I felt quite explicitly. So let me push back and see whether I can, help you revise your view of what I'm saying in the book. Maybe to cut to the chase, the important things for Blake, I think, are, well, the important thing in a way is desire. What are our desires doing? But Blake is very, very clear that if you try and manage your desires, let alone curtail and limit your desires, then you cut yourself off from the primary possibility that your humanity might be fulfilled, which is by finding the true goal of its desires, which is the divine, which is understanding the wellspring that's within us and rediscovering how that is the wellspring within all things. So it's nothing. It's absolutely not about managerialism. I try to say that Blake is neither antinomian nor legalistic, but I try and use this word transnomian. That it's by moving through things like the attempt to manage, to legislate, to govern, that you discover that your desire can become focused on the true object of its yearning, of its hope, of its longing, of its fulfillment. But that's got to be the divine. It's got to be the all. It's got to be the infinite. So, for example, we mentioned these early pamphlets that Blake wrote, and there's no natural religion being one. And there's the plate in that where he says, more is the cry of a forsaken soul. Or is it deluded soul? I can't remember actually quite what the word is now. More is the cry of a forsaken soul, anyway. And so he's criticizing this attempt to procure in order to satisfy. No matter how you try and do that, whether you manage it, whether you just go for it, if you've got the means, whatever. But then he says nothing less than all will satisfy man. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. He is saying that we are finite creatures with this sense and taste for the infinite, as his contemporary Friedrich Schleiermacher put it. And we're temporal creatures that know the eternal. We're mortal creatures that have a yearning for what's immortal. And unless we take that seriously, we're going to mess things up, either by trying to kind of juggle, trying to balance, going for excess, going for too much limit. It's a kind of education, and it's an education of the imagination that really is at the heart of Blake, I think. And it really isn't about managerialism. when it comes to therapy, part of my interest in Blake is I do agree that a lot of psychology, I think it's a bit different in psychotherapy where I work, but certainly a lot of the help that people offer in psychology is about trying to, get things enough but not too much. I sometimes feel it's a bit like being told you've got to just get one more plate spinning. If only you can get that seventh plate spinning, as it were, that seventh aspect of your mind, you'll be kind of doing all right.
I
But
really,
very, very, it can help people actually. I mean, if you're in real crisis, you need some techniques. So I don't want to dismiss that. But if that is seen as the sum total of what psychology might be able to offer you, it is only going to be able to offer you a kind of balancing game throughout your life, and not the connection with the all that Blake and others in the mystical tradition particularly see. Just to comment as well on what you said about Jesus. I mean, I didn't write about this explicitly in the Blake book, but I've previously written about it in a book on Christianity, and said that I think that reading Jesus's aphorisms and his parables, like, it's easier for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for the camel to go through the eye of the needle, as if they're somehow descriptive of a moral recommendation, fundamentally misunderstands what Jesus was about. Partly because a lot of his aphorisms and parables are, on that reading, amoral, if not immoral. The first will be last, and so on. What could be more offensive to a moral view of things? But what Jesus is trying to do is again, I think Blake is trying to do is kind of imaginatively jolt you into a completely different perception of things, where it's not about whether you manage money or not. It's about what your life is in the service of. And you need a bit of money to manage things materially, but what your life is in the service of is really the crucial question. And for some, that might mean giving it all up. And Jesus does say to some figures that he meets, you've got to give it all up. But to others, he doesn't. He accepts very luxurious hospitality, for example. It's said that one of the disciples managed the purse. I mean, if you want to go really quite literal about it, at Jesus's birth, he was given a small fortune in the wise men. He's not against money per se, because that itself becomes a kind of satanic obsession. It becomes a kind of antichrist, as if you measure your Christianity by what you're against. But in the spiritual traditions, you see, I think this is really important. The spiritual teacher says to the individual what matters in that moment. They never give universal precepts or universal laws. That's what religiosity does. And so Blake can say it's religion passing as religion, but killing religion, even in the same moment. What matters is what's needed in the moment. And I think, again, this is very much part of the imaginative understanding of things. It's always dynamic. It's always unfolding. And the question is, what's the next move? And what's that next move in the service of? What's the wider vision that's steering all things? And so, I could go on about this, but I hope you at least feel the force of my pushback from the reading. I'm really hoping, actually, that that's precisely not what people come away with when they've read my book.
You mentioned in the introduction that a lot of your learning of Blake came through the Temenos Academy, and you mentioned also that your background's in Greek philosophy. I found it extremely Greek and Neoplatonic, and the whole book, in its whole demeanor. And I think you'll be glad that I said that, because I think that is your essential demeanor, and that's what I want to engage with. And of course, if it were as easy as a managerial approach versus a non-managerial approach, of course, there wouldn't be any argument there. But it's a matter of how we read our way through. So the tendency I find in a lot of Blakeanism, certainly a lot of Jungian Blakeanism, certainly, and I think in a lot of Neoplatonism, or actually, to be more specific, in traditionalism, as a take on Neoplatonism, so to say. So you say at one point in your book, not that you're against equality, but you say equality isn't the main thing for a political system. A political system should be concerned with the spiritual development of people. And so what that made me think is the tendency that I perceive in Neoplatonism to adjust people to reality. In my world, what that is reminiscent of is the critique of a sort of ultra-leftism, right? That it's not accommodated to reality. It doesn't work in reality. It's a kind of abstract sloganeering. So the young Lukács founder of Western Marxism, criticized Trotsky from a Hegelian point of view, saying Trotsky doesn't know how to reconcile with reality, how to actually make things happen. He's a fantasist. And I find that tendency in traditionalism and Neoplatonism very, very strong. So I'll give you an example in your book. So you talk about the money problem, but you talk about the problem of sort of having too much money or pursuing it or pursuing consumer goods and all those kind of things. And you sort of say that's not the main thing in life, money. But I would say, what about the problem that you don't touch on of people have no money? And I kind of did a search through your book. I thought, let's search for the word slave. And actually, I've got a draft of the book from your publisher. So I do have the book, but I can't search through that electronically, right? So I
No,
was
I'm going to
searching
leap in here. Andy, I wasn't allowed to use the word slave because
really.
the expression you need to look up is enslaved people or enslaved Africans, and then you'll discover where I discuss slavery.
Point is that I thought that, but there's this, as you know, this idea of the Anglican Church as the Tory party at prayer. I thought a lot of the problems you addressed were the problems of wealthy people who wanted to do a bit better, but not necessarily people who'd been raped, tortured. I don't know how you say to them, look, don't be too concerned. I know you're not saying that it doesn't matter what happens to those people. But of course, the tendency in Neoplatonism is to take the spiritual. You talk about it as a
I've got to
non-spiritual.
leap in here. I think you've got a caricature of Neoplatonism, which I do understand because if you read an introduction to Neoplatonism, it might come across like that. And also the way that particularly Plato has been appropriated in the academy has inclined in that direction, particularly through the middle part of the 20th century. So that the standout figure is Karl Popper here, and his accusation in the Open Society and its enemies that Plato was an armchair tyrant. Now that is being revised very substantially, thank goodness. I mean, actually, Popper, even in his own autobiography, said that he had presented just a caricature of Plato because he wrote his book during the Second World War, didn't have access to good text because he was in New Zealand and so on. So he'd just gone on his prejudices. And I think prejudice is actually the word he uses. So there's a big revision going on. And for example, one of the revisions that's going on is the recognition that Plotinus, the key figure in Neoplatonism anyway, in his own life, not only founded a city called Plotinia, but also looked after orphans and those who didn't have parents. That was part of his work. So there's a huge revision of all that going on. When it comes to Blake, the angle that I try and focus on is recognizing, for example, that he lived in the time of enslaved Africans, although slavery was also abolished in his time, and also referencing some of the way that he describes that. Those figures actually now, which if you look them up online, come with a kind of trigger warning. Like the Negro being hung from the tree and so on. But what I think is more important in our times is that we hold on to this quality of what Blake calls innocence. And so this is, for example, in the Chimney Sweep poems that he writes. And I describe, quite how horrendous the business of sending even 4-year-olds, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds up chimneys was in the time. But that Blake wants us not just to get outraged about that, because he sees that as part of the tearing apart of society. Remember that the idea that there's a left and a right was born in his times as a result of the French Revolution. He wants us to try and keep a focus on our humanity. And if you can keep a focus on the humanity of things, then you realize that, as you said just now, figures like Donald Trump are symptoms that belong to us, not to other people. And it's only by recovering a fullness of our humanity that we can hope to transcend these problems. So I feel that Blake's message very much to our times is not to want to go for either the outrage or for the kind of materialist solution. That will just perpetuate the trap that's been unfolding in the last 200 years. He wants us to rediscover what it is to be human and then to see the fullness of our humanity and the connection with others. For politics, I think to draw back. I think that we've turned to politics far too much to try to solve these problems. The political now inveigles its way into every aspect of our lives. And what gets lost then is the sense that the spiritual might play actually a more basic part than the political. And we need to recover that, because only then are we really attending to what it is to be human, and to the human yearnings that lie behind, that get co-opted by this otherwise over preoccupation in my sense with the material. This is the genius of capitalism, that it takes our spiritual yearning and turns it solely either to the accumulation of goods in the form of consumerism, or to the sense that somehow all our problems will be solved if only we have material equality. I think that's part and parcel of the same split into what became known as the left and the right in Blake's times, that he wants us to get both sort of beyond and under and through and over. So, I also talk, as well as talking about transnomianism, I talk about misenchantment. And I think that this is all connected with the tight knot of our troubles that Blake wants to help undo.
I totally get what you're saying about this idea. I suppose what you're rejecting is this idea that Plato was a totalitarian, as Popper would have put it, which is quite possibly true, but I'm not sure that solves the problem, as it were. And another way to think about it is this: you kind of, we talk about the spiritual side of things and then the kind of material side of things, not just your salary or your income or how much time off you get, but your whole political situation, your ease, whether you're oppressed, not oppressed. And the relation between that and spirituality. Now, as I said earlier, I don't want to give anyone the impression that I'm saying that Mark just counterposes it and says choose one rather than the other. But where you're sort of trying to commingle them or talk about their relationship, it bears on something that has increasingly occurred to me, which is the issue in Blake of when he talks about contraries and negations and so on. It's right to say you don't take a managerial view of playing off these things, but you talk about a kind of dynamism. You roll with what you're doing, but at the same time, you understand its limits, but it's an opportunity to learn, and et cetera, et cetera.
No, it's not about understanding its limits. It's about understanding what can come in from that dynamism.
Yeah,
so this business about the third thing, Blake says there's a moment in each day that Satan, i.e. the contractive you, can't find, but the industrious find this moment and it multiply. And I think that this is absolutely fundamental to Blake, and it's very, very Christian. The idea that we're in the world, thoroughly in the world. Of course we are. We're human and mortal, but we're not of the world. And so we must be imaginatively attentive to how something new and different can break through. And that's why Blake's very interested, for example, in eschatology. Eschatology for him is not something that might come at some indefinite point in the future, but is that which might be present in every moment. As Blake says, whenever a truth occurs to someone, that's when the final judgment has come upon them as well. So the contraries hold open that possibility for something new to emerge. It's nothing to do with balance or getting it right. It's the expectancy through the imagination that life can be changed.
But how do you, again, you have to relate them in some kind of way. So you're right to say that you don't accept a kind of managerial approach. And I was wrong to characterize your position as one of you will find the limits of action through action. You do absolutely say you're opening yourself up to something that will come in. But at the same time, that's not particularly Blake in thought. Goethe said, theory is grey, my friend. Green is the tree of life. This notion that, you have to pull your sleeves up, pull your socks up and get stuck in. Or as Napoleon said when he invaded Russia, on s'engage puis on voit, get stuck in and see. At the same time, there is a debate about this Blakean contraries versus negation and how much negativity you're allowed. Because the idea increasingly, so I read this in the John Higgs book and in Jason Whittaker's book about Jerusalem. Both of them concur that, and you say much the same yourself, that the contraries, in a way, their interplay is positive. They're not they're not mutually annihilating. They're, in a sense, productive. And when you talk about having a job or something, you talk about a dynamism, a disequilibrium in this thing. But my sense of it all is that that I don't know precisely what Blake meant when he contrasted negation and contraries. But the way it's interpreted is that you can have a disagreement, but as long as you don't take it too seriously and punch the other guy, it's cool.
So the negation is essentially when you deny that a contrary is in a dynamic relationship with something else. I mean, I think that a useful two thoughts come to mind. One is to do with Blake's life himself, and one is to do with, I think, the bit of science actually that Blake was drawing on when he talked about contraries. Maybe do the science bit first, because the sort of exciting science, or one of the elements of the exciting science in his time, was electromagnetism. He's contemporary with figures like Faraday. And so the poles of a magnet, I think, gave him the idea of the contraries. And so the poles of a magnet, the north and the south, they hold the field of the magnet, and it's in the field that the energy is. And if you say, well, look, I'm a North Pole kind of person, I don't like the South Pole, and so you try and negate this relationship, well, actually what happens is you just end up replicating the contrary in another place, and the North Pole becomes a South Pole too, as it were, when you cut it off from its first South Pole. So that there's no denying this. And if you try and deny it, therefore, you negate in a deeper sense that you're denying what is. And I think that's the fundamental sense for Blake, that the negation is denying what is. And so it's the fall into the sleep of Ulro. It's the collapse into single vision and Newton sleep and so on. But also just to say that I think this is played out in Blake's life. So partly the insight here, I think, and this is why I try and present it in the book, because there's a lot about Blake's own life in the book too. When you're thinking about, okay, so take Blake's attitude to money. And what tends to happen, I think, with people that read Blake is they kind of grab one bit and take that as the whole. So they may remember, for example, this story about Mrs. Blake, Catherine, putting an empty plate in front of Blake to remind him that they need to earn some money to eat and so on. And then they take that to be, the Blakes lived in poverty, Blake would have given up money, given half the chance and so on. And it's a rather leftist kind of view. But on the other hand, you can also read Blake when he describes discovering, for example, the etching process, that he used to make his work. And when he writes about that, part of the appeal for him was he said, I'd be able to make illuminated manuscripts much more cheaply, and therefore I'll be able to sell a lot of them. And he undoubtedly wanted to be commercially successful as well. He wanted to be commercially successful for material reasons, as well as because he wanted his message to get out into the world. So the question is, how are you going to handle that contrary in Blake's own life? And I think the way you do it is, at least the way that it speaks to me, is it was precisely with living amidst those tensions that Blake's distinctiveness came about. Part of the reason why we love him now is because of the particularity of his work, his voice. It's absolutely Blake. It's Blake himself, and that's what we love. That's why people flock to Blake now. And I think that could only have come about because Blake didn't try and resolve the immediate tensions in his life, if you like. Am I going to become an impoverished, creative and live in my attic, or am I going to just kind of go for the commercial thing and make money? And no, he wanted something else entirely, which was to pursue his voice and get it out into the world. And so that for me is the kind of the lesson. Or maybe lesson's not quite the right word. I mean the hope or the inspiration that we get from Blake is that he doesn't rest on what can become so preoccupying for now. Are we basically a materialist? Are we basically spiritual? Are we a Marxist or are we a capitalist and whatever? We know that has not served us well over the last 200 years. Look where it's led us, to the fragmented world in which we live now. And Blake is saying we need to rediscover who we are, our humanity, and realize that the transcendent is imminent right in front of us. The world is in a grain of sand. That's what we must pay attention to.
You have an interest in, ancient Greek philosophy. We also need to situate this within philosophy at large, okay? So a lot of those ideas, negations, contraries, if you say those words to me, I go, bang, Hegel, right? Because Hegel...
Well, remember, Blake didn't read Hegel. Hegel is a development.
But he did read Boehm, who Hegel said was the first ever German philosopher and claimed to be based on Boehm. So this idea, in fact, the first book I ever read as a Marxist, when I was sort of being recruited into a Marxist organization, I thought, I'm not going to get suckered, right? I'm going to read something highly critical. And I read Leszek Kolakowski's 3-volume Main Currents of Marxism, which covers really well the origins of Hegelian dialectics in theologians like Origen, in the idea that God sloughs off the world in order to know himself, comes to know himself, and therefore arrives at a higher dialectic. These ideas of how things are opposed, how you have contraries, what is a negation, what is the sublation, how do you overcome common philosophical tropes in a certain tradition? And as you say, of course, so Blake didn't read Hegel, but he read Bohème, and they're all there.
And there's a huge dispute now about what Bohème meant. And I think that this sloughing off reading of Bohème, let alone reading it back into figures like Origin, is a fundamental mistake. And because what it's forgotten is that we're talking about the divine here. I think these ideas that somehow you can only know yourself by distancing yourself from yourself and creating some kind of contrary tension, that Hegelian dialectic, that is to imagine that God's kind of like us, but just a bit bigger. I don't think Bohème actually meant that. I mean, people are rereading Bohème now because that has, I do agree, has become the kind of the way that he's read. But I think what Blake understood was, I think, what's in the Platonic tradition actually, and it's in words like emanation, that it's in the very being of God to produce, to overflow, to emanate. The many are part of the one, not some sort of separation from the one. And I think Blake knew this, and that's what part of what he's trying to get to hold of and re-educate us in.
There's so much to talk about here. It should be blatantly obvious to anyone listening to this that if you wanted to pan these issues out, you'd be having a whole series of podcasts, right? There's too much to address directly. So I want to do something that you're going to feel is like a debating trick. I want to try and interpret this in the real world. And one of the things that interests me about the Temenos people is that I'm sure they're very, I met a few of them. I did a course with Valentin as well. When you say the thing about equality, you know, that equality isn't the main thing. We need a political formation that encourages spiritual development. That is very much the tenor of right-wing traditionalism, right? René Guénon and people like that. But it's real because it's also what people like Steve Bannon, you know, former Trump advisor, is saying. He's a traditionalist. And those people believe that A, equality is not important because, you know, people aren't equal, so it's not important. People do need a spiritual society, and that's why he wants basically a theocracy. And I think that if I couple with that, and I'm not ascribing Steve Bannon's views to you at all. Like, what I'm trying to describe is why it is reasonable to be skeptical about some of the claims of traditionalism at large, given that it can extend to this. I want to just combine that with one thing. And again, I'm not ascribing Bannon's views to you. I'm explaining my wariness. But the other thing you critique is wokeness, okay, because it's judgmental. I view wokeness in a very different way. I think wokeness is in many ways the key to everything. If you look at the rise of capitalism, right, there's slavery, America perfected that, the oppression of women, one after the other, these things were addressed sort of originally as separate issues. But in our day today, increasingly, it looks like empathy for other people. You know, Elon Musk said a month or so ago that the fundamental bug in capitalism is empathy. Because if we didn't have empathy, capitalism could just run purely, we could just run untrammeled. I want to say what I'm thinking so that you can respond, and you're welcome to come back. But I think other people would share, you know, knowing the background of traditionalism, would say, okay, if you're sort of down on woke, you think it's sort of problematic, not wrong or evil, but it has this real downside. If you're down on equality, look, the over-enthusiastic pursuit of equality just produces fanaticism. You know, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, these are basically, they're not bad, you could have leaped straight in. But, you know, there's this huge problem with a society that takes equality and woke seriously. I actually see wokeness as, basically, I think Musk is right. Empathy is the major bug in capitalism because Christ taught us to empathize and sympathize. You also have a section on sympathy, so I'll allow you to talk about that. But can you understand why someone, say, coming from my background, which may not be a typical background for your reader, but knowing about traditionalism, and I should explain to listeners, by the way, that what I'm complaining about, fascist traditionalism, basically says we should live in a kind of theocracy because that would be spiritually better for everyone. And everyone has their role in society to play, but your role can be as a priest or as a worker or as a ruler. So it's the Aryan, the Brahmins, the warriors, and, the house owners. Within that context, if you're coming out of a traditionalist background, then it is, I think, something that you do sort of need to address more clearly to your readers why. A kind of wariness about the same things that, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and Steve Bannon are worried about, wokeism, equality. I don't believe, by the way, that those guys, the reason they don't like these things is because they're for the untrammeled development of capitalism, which manifestly you are not. But where there might be an overlap is in a shared disinclination to mess around with society too radically.
Let me just pick up on the traditionalism. What's happened with traditionalism and perennialism and so on is that what was a very diverse range of views about the common element within different traditions, because of the fascist inclination of certain traditionalists, I mean, perhaps the one who's really most overtly clearly in that tradition because he was aligned with Mussolini was Evola, who sometimes grouped him with this lot. But because we live now in such a split world, just by mentioning the F word in the context, say, of my book, it immediately forces me to have to defend what I'm trying to say against something that really I wanted nothing to do with in the starting place. I could have written a book and saying, Blake is a sort of perennialist, but we must be careful because of this way that it became associated with fascism. But then the book would have been about traditionalism and how to hold that apart. What I was trying to do in the book is say, no, Blake's got his own particular and distinctive way of feeling into these things, communicating these things. And you don't need to bother in a way with all that noise. What we need to do is try and rise above that noise by seeing clearly what he is trying to say. Now, I think I must defend very strongly the Temenos Academy as well. I mean, partly there are different views in the Temenos Academy, in fact, about the perennial undercurrents in different traditions and so on. And the way that the Temenos Academy grapples with that is by saying, let's not go to these big abstract ideas. Are we for this or against that? Let's engage with these texts and work out how they might be speaking to us. And I think that's the way to do it, because otherwise you just throw out the baby with the bathwater. You think we can't get anywhere near this because of the taint of fascism, for example. Or, we've got to decide, are we for or against, which immediately takes us into a kind of abstract, generalized realm, which is precisely what Blake was against, because he felt that uncouples us from the reality of things which are right in front of us, which are, of course, thoroughly material and immersive. And that is how the revelation comes to us. So, your discussion about sympathy and empathy there is another good case in point. Empathy actually is a word you won't find in Blake because it didn't exist for about another 100 years till after Blake, along with words like solidarity and so on. And these are Victorian words that I think come about because of this sense of crisis. We've created an imagination that's uncoupling us from the pulse of life. We're living now in these abstract realms, when you're either for or against something, you're of the left, you're of the right, you're pro-equality or anti-equality, as if that's going to be the determining sort of sticker that gets put on your forehead to say where you belong. And this uncouples people. It leads to the culture wars and so on. It leads to the way that people can become excessively wealthy to the detriment of others who are just, feeding into that production of wealth, because the common sense of humanity is being lost. And so I think Blake saw this coming. He does use the word sympathy. He also uses the word pity, which in Blake's time didn't mean I pity you in a rather derogatory sense, but was a sort of synonym for sympathy, really. But he also says, as well as, we must have pity, he also notes that pity divides the soul. Because if you're not careful, what was happening at the time was, again, a bit like the imagination being privatized as if it was my own possession. So too, sympathy was being treated as if it was my own possession. And I might have sympathy for you, or I might not. I might have pity for you, or I might not. But Blake spotted that even if you do have sympathy or pity for someone else, written into that is a sense of a kind of abyss between us. And so you're perpetuating the abyss, even as you're trying to reach out to someone. And what Blake wanted us to do, which actually takes us right back to the beginning of our conversation, is to realize that sympathy originally meant the way that there's an inflow, there's an inspiration, there's an influx into us that calls forth our response from the wider world, from the cosmos itself, from the divine, and so lifts us constantly through diving more deeply into that which is around us, rather than making us feel we've got this kind of fundamental problem that we're separate, that we're dead, that we're isolated, that we need political and social fixes for. If only we can get the right formula right in society, then all these problems will go. Blake saw it coming, and I think, to my mind, it's completely self-evidently the case because of the 200 years of political experimentation that's gone ever since, and it's only getting more and more out of control, that we need a reset. We need to rediscover something basic, fundamental, and I think Blake can help us do that.
One thing I want to say is that I really enjoyed your discussion of sympathy, actually, and it was a very interesting one given the history of it and so on. But I'm surprised you didn't mention that it's exactly what Newton was accused of in his theory of gravitation. By Leibniz accused him of, having elective affinities and all these kind of alchemical concepts.
I
Which
mean, I do mention in the footnote about how Newton was influenced by Ficino, and the notion of the eros was a kind of daemon pervasive throughout the cosmos, and gravity is this force of attraction that's pervasive throughout the cosmos.
I find that when I read the New Testament, I find this, what today might be called empathy, which would have been called something different then, is so fundamental. I was reading David Bentley Hart, the Greek Orthodox guy. He says he's not a theologist, so I'm not allowed to call him that, but he's such a fascinating writer. And for him, the two key things about Christianity are, one, the kind of, radicalism of Christ's expectations, that we're against the world. But the other thing he says is it's impossible for us today to imagine in literary terms, what is the proposition when Christ is in front of Pilate. It's impossible for us to see how a pagan would have seen that as being utterly ridiculous. The idea that God was contained in the being of a peasant from Galilee was utterly inconceivable to the pagan world. And that's what, to me, Christianity, one of the things it brings, one of the key things it brings to the table, this kind of empathy, because it's not based on my empathizing with Christ that I see him in that way, but that sense of the essential divinity of people. And so recognizing that in others makes empathy possible. And I think this is a very radical part of Christianity. And I do think the woke thing is a defense of empathy against capital. But letting that pass, I want to go on to the final.
But look, the trouble with woke, so I try and be nuanced about this as well. The trouble with woke, and it's implicit in the way you're describing it now, because it's saying there's divinity in you and divinity in me that somehow we need to sort of recognize. But it's forgetting that's part of a shared divinity of the whole cosmos, and of course of the divine itself. The risk is that we reduce everything to a kind of flatland, even if it's a sort of divinized spiritual flatland. But what Blake is saying is we must recognize that everything is open to the more, to the all, and then we don't have to have empathy, which means feeling into, quite literally, as if all that has to happen is a kind of bilateral agreement or arrangement. What we need to recognize is that we're all sharing in part of a much wider vision and life of things. And then the political is necessary, but it recognizes itself as not sufficient. What it can do is create good enough conditions so that more and more people are able to recognize this wider and wider vision. So it's precisely not a theocracy. A theocracy is when religious rulers claim that they've got God on their side and impose rules on people beneath them. That's a horrendous perversion of this vision. What it's saying is that we need sort of minimalist politics that enables people to recognize that everybody shares in this divine perspective. And then what you hope is that when this is a living vitality and people know this in their souls, as it were, they don't want to hoard materially because they recognize that more is the cry of a mistaken soul, and nothing less than all will satisfy us. But unless you put that in place, if you try to sort of, as it were, make the tail wag the dog, which I think has been often the mistake, both of the left and the right, they might claim not to have their plans to change society, but you only have to remember Mrs. Thatcher's remarks about the point is to change people's souls, to realize that that is the excess of politics generally in our times, because we've sort of fallen out of faith or lost trust with a wider flow of meaning and purpose that actually shapes us all along. We've all fallen into this narrow vision and Newton's sleep. And what we need, and I think Blake recognized this, is to reawaken the capacity of the imagination to reach out for more. And only then will our politics provide its rightful place, supporting that awakening.
Because I do still have a little bit of Hegel in me. I know that everything is full of contradictions. I don't even, I knew that before I read Blake sort of thing. I mean, my complaint is that people think that Blake is less like Hegel than he is, put it that way. I think the amount of negation in Blake is seriously underestimated in the direction of just a vague liberalism. We should disagree, but we can all get on. I mean, Professor Whittaker argues this. Everybody who sings Blake's Jerusalem is part of Albion, right? And we can all get on. And he gives the examples of the Tory party and the Labour Party. But what about the BNP, the actual capital F fascists, who also sing Blake's Jerusalem? But I'm not part of that Albion.
When you read the celestial hierarchies, and of course Dionysius actually invents the word hierarchy, what he's describing there is not a hierarchy that separates, which is the way that the word has come to be used now, but precisely a way of saying things can be distinct but not different. And so that all these levels that he describes are actually mediating levels that are all levels are present in every other level. In the many is always present the one, because otherwise the many would fall out of existence altogether. And this is precisely, I think, the vision that we need to recover. Otherwise, you just get lost in the condemnation of what you don't like and the sort of vain assertion of what you wish was the case.
What did you learn from Blake that is specific to Blake, a sort of Neoplatonic or traditionalist or a perennial? Was there anything in Blake that isn't in Plotinus and all those other people other than his artistic ability to communicate through myth these ideas? Is there something that is specifically Blakean and utterly resistant to, for example, a perennialism, let's say? Blake brings the words, we bring the meaning.
Blake is not like this tabula rasa that you can just read any old meaning onto. Words and meaning can't be separated. Words carry a soul. This is part of the minute particulars. This is part of the immanence of the transcendent. And I think what Blake is trying to do is, in our times, to put word and image, and if we were alive and listening to him directly, also music, together in such a way to release the vision afresh. You were not at liberty just to read whatever we want to on Blake. Although I do agree, some people do that. They kind of grab a bit and then say, I'll just run with that. That's what's inspired me. We must wrestle with what he was trying to show us and then ask ourselves, in this tradition, which is very much part of the Neoplatonic tradition, how that is manifest in our times. The Neoplatonic tradition is a bit like a subterranean river, and it throws up springs and rivers and new fonts of meaning in every moment. I reject the reading of Blake as being advocate of free love. I think what he's an advocate is what I call large love, which isn't a wholly happy phrase, but is at least different from free love because of this sacramental view, because that's in Visions of the Daughters of Albion, which is one of the times where he says everything that lives is holy. That true love, as it were, reveals to you. The thing about Blake is that he definitely values the body. There's absolutely no doubt about it. He's a material artist. He experiments all the time with the material, but it's always in the service of revealing what the material is really about. And hence, like he says, the body is that way in which, in this age, we've come to understand the soul, but it needs to be remembered that the body in its material form is always already alive. I mean, look at me waving my hands around. And when you encounter someone, you don't encounter a body, you encounter a soul. Ultimately, it's the body of Christ that stands before you. And the body of Christ stands for the infinite as well as the finite. One of my favorite pictures of Blake's is when he depicts Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. And what it shows is the moment in the story where the persecutors are leaving and it's just Jesus and the woman, and you're not quite sure what's going to happen next, because Jesus has said, let the one without sin cast the first stone. And of course, in the story, Jesus is the one without sin, so he could cast the first stone. It's the poignant moment where we're not sure whether the woman is going to find freedom or condemnation.
I'm not here to simply dismiss things. I do disagree with what I have characterised as a kind of neo-traditionalist strain. People have heard what I think about that. They've heard what you think about.
Although my book is written for the general reader, so I don't go down all these rabbit holes of trying to tease out this, that, and the other, which, you know, you and I might enjoy in a podcast discussion like this. It is written for the general reader, but nonetheless, I do have these things in the back of my mind because I do think really something is very important at stake for those who love Blake. Blake has become, I think, this tabula rasa onto which you can more or less throw anything you like. And Blake is saying something quite particular. He's got a sharp mind as well as a brilliant imagination. And I think unless we ask ourselves, you know, what, and this is a very Temenos Academy principle, what is Blake saying to us? Not just what we might want to Blake have say to us. Unless we try and approach him with a kind of innocence again, which of course Blake said dwells with the wise, not with the ignorant.
I mean, the way I see it is this. What Blake is saying is very like a Zen koan, right? In that it makes no sense whatsoever until you understand it, and then it's kind of trivially obvious once you've seen it. The impact of Blake on me was to stop me being a materialist, monist, Marxist, and make me a Christian. I did not read Marxism into it, and I'm sure many of the people who kind of come to the Traveller in the Evening site probably think that I do, because I read Blake as a great radical in the tradition of the left wing of the English Civil War. So they're probably thinking, but I'm also thinking to myself, to what extent is this just me staring into Blake, seeing what I want to see? But I do know that Blake had a fundamental and profound impact on me in that he made me a Christian, and I learned that. And so I'm saying, in the sense that I know it's possible to learn from Blake, but I know the temptation is always to read into Blake what you already believed, which is why my trick question these days is to ask people, what did you learn from Blake as opposed to books about Blake? What was new in Blake? So I agree with you in your characterization of the Blakeosphere. I'm actually, the more I think about it, the more utterly horrified I am at the low stock of Blake in the real world right now. You know, at one point, Blake was a darling of the counterculture. But increasingly, he's seen as a small businessman who wasn't a radical. I'm utterly horrified. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm horrified. I hope it's been really, really illuminating for our readers. In listening to this discussion, you thought that Mark was talking absolute rubbish, or whether you thought I was talking absolute rubbish, or we're both talking absolute rubbish. Having said that, Mark, thank you for joining me once again. But to everybody else, thank you for joining us today. However you're listening to this podcast, as I always say, it's probably been shared on Apple or wherever it is. It's coming from the Traveller in the Evening blog, which is on Substack. And all you've got to do is look up Traveller in the Evening, basically. Please do that in order to subscribe. And I noticed this week, because I don't have any paywall anywhere, anybody can read the whole thing. Nothing is hidden. So please visit the Traveller in the Evening. Please subscribe. Consider a paid subscription. That having been said, once again, thank you again, Mark. I'm sweating a little bit. It is a hot day, but it's also partly because we had such a heated discussion. But thanks again. And thanks to everybody who tuned in to listen to us. And I will see you the next time we have one of our occasional podcasts. Thank you. Bye, everyone.